Hello, everyone. So we are live again for yet another author live chat, and it's a pleasure to meet all of you again in yet another author live chat. And today, 24th July 2022, 8 p.m. CST, we are live again with yet another non-fiction author. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about a serious or probably a heavy subject, and we have author David Lucky with us today to talk about his book, which is on exposing Putin's lies. And so, a little bit about the author over here. So, after graduating early from high school at 15, David Lucky earned a BA degree in philosophy from California State Fullerton. David has written several articles for magazine journals on international politics and has traveled worldwide to over 25 countries, including numerous trips to Ukraine and Russia. He is a man of many interests and talents, a chess champion, inventor, and entrepreneur. Putin's brutal, unjust invasion of Ukraine inspired David to stand up and speak out against the great evil of Russian propaganda and aggression. David calls on the civilized world to confront Putin's evil by exposing the lies and propaganda which are supporting the brutal aggression in Ukraine. David enjoys tennis, traveling, coffee, good conversation, and nature. He's an admirer of the arts, great architecture, and all types of cultural achievement. So, without further ado, let's welcome author David Lucky to the show.
Oh,
Hello,
thank you for inviting me.
David. Hello, David. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Thank you.
Awesome. Right. Thank you for joining the show today. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I really think that, today we're going to talk a little bit about something that matters to the world right now. A heavy subject it is, but I know it is heavier for people in the Ukraine who are going through the impact of the war, right? So we've seen a lot of people losing their homes. We've seen a lot of families being separated, all because of political um, differences among different nations. And today we are going to talk a little bit more about that from your perspective and from your experiences of having had traveled to numerous countries. So I hope that today we will be able to look at things from a different perspective from your experience. So before that, David, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that I've actually briefly introduced yourself, but I think it would be good to have you tell a little bit about yourself to the audience.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. As you mentioned, I had received a degree in philosophy many years ago, and I follow world politics, geopolitics. I've traveled to over 25 countries, and I've been following some of the events in Russia for many years. Before that, the Soviet Union, Ukraine. I have some heritage from Ukraine. My grandmother was actually born in Ukraine. There's a chapter in the introduction about that. She actually had to flee after her parents were killed
Mm-hmm.
by the Bolsheviks in Ukraine. Um, and so I do have some history. I know a lot of people in Ukraine and in Russia. I'm all for world peace. All of my efforts right now are directed towards creating peace in the world. And that's a tricky issue, but at its fundamental core, the best way to have uh, long-term peace is through exposing lies and propaganda and talking about the truth. And I feel that, well, not only do I feel that, but I know after studying this for a long time, the the war is essentially fueled and supported by lies, propaganda, fiction, mythology. And if those lies and fiction and mythology are exposed, that'll eventually help bring an end to the war, is my belief.
Right. So we know that this is actually a recent incident, like, the Ukraine-Russia war. So when did you, what made you want to actually write this book?
So what made me want to write this book was early on in the war, which started February 24th. Actually, I was watching it weeks before that. For several weeks before the war started, Russia/Putin was mounting tens of thousands of troops on the border, and they were all basically, Putin and his inner circle were all going on interviews, talking to people, telling the media, the press, everybody that they were not going to attack Ukraine. They were promising everybody, every time they were asked about that, that they were not going to attack Ukraine. That ended up being a lie and propaganda because, as we know, they did attack and invade Ukraine on February 24th. So I've been following the situation very closely. Since then, I've had numerous discussions, many online discussions with lots of people. And I ran into lots of Putin apologists and lots of trolls. And I see the propaganda that has been pushed. And a lot of people are losing arguments. They're losing the propaganda battle because they don't know a lot of the details. They don't know what's going on. And the propaganda is very tricky. Putin and his oligarch friends, and this is all mentioned in the book, they have hired over 50,000 trolls to go online every day, working 10, 11, 12 hours a day, pushing this propaganda. And these people, these trolls, they have up to 100 fake social media accounts where they're pretending to be Americans or pretending to be Europeans. They have YouTube accounts, Twitter, Instagram, other social media accounts, and they're just pushing these lies and propaganda day and night, and they're winning a lot of converts. There are a lot of people right now that are starting to side with Putin. I think that the majority of people are against Putin, but the numbers are shifting, and that's because they don't have the accurate information. They don't know what's going on, and the lies are very tricky. They're very believable if you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. So I decided months ago, nearly 5 months ago, that people need to have the information and at their fingertips. And so that's why I wrote this book, was to give people the information so that they have the truth in front of them of what's going on.
Right. And who do you think, this book is actually targeted to? Like, what is your target audience like? When you're writing this book, who do you think were you having on your mind?
Right, good question. So pretty much it's targeted towards a lot of people. Anybody who is following the news, anybody who is paying attention to global events, uh, anybody who is even casually looking at this situation uh, with Russia attacking Ukraine. I would say that a lot of people this should involve. Now, on one level, every human on some level has a stake in this game that's going on. And what I mean by that is this. The world is flirting with just utter devastation. If this were to expand, now hopefully it doesn't expand, but we are right on the verge of a World War III. Now, I don't think that will happen, but it could if things spin out of control, and that could be devastating for the whole world. I mean, already a lot of countries
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, including Russia, including Ukraine, including the United States and Europe, we are already seeing massive inflation everywhere. We're seeing
Mm-hmm.
supply shortages. We're seeing
Mm-hmm.
food shortages. It's
Exactly.
already, people are already predicting that millions of people are going to be starving in Africa and other
Mm-hmm.
countries because food is not getting out of Ukraine. So this really affects large portions of the world. So I think that uh, most people in the world are affected by this and should understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the research, the kind of research involved to write this book, and also time taken to write this book. How were you like collecting information or saving facts and figures in order to write this book? So walk us through the process a little bit so that we could understand how you researched about the book for the
Sure,
book.
very good question.
Mhm.
So I've actually been researching and following events that are happening in Russia
Mhm.
uh, and Ukraine for over 20
Mhm.
years. In fact, I was
Mhm.
following the situation starting December of 1999 when
Mhm.
Boris Yeltsin first appointed Vladimir Putin as the new president of Russia.
Mhm.
I had a bad feeling about that at that time
Mhm.
because I knew that, well, prior to that, Russia was moving in a very good, positive direction with
Mhm.
Yeltsin. They were gaining freedoms. The country was liberalizing. They were opening up. Uh, they were becoming more of a democratic country. When Putin came into power in 2000, uh, he came in from, he was an ex KGB agent. And I had a bad feeling about that at that point because the problem is he was still bringing in a Cold War mentality at that point. So I've
Mhm.
been following the situation for about 20 years. So one of the problems is that
Mhm.
he brought in a Cold War mentality, which means
Mhm.
that he still wanted to increase the power of Russia. He wanted to bring back Russian imperialism. Uh, he's made several statements, and this is all documented in the book and in other places, that he believes that the worst geopolitical crisis of the 20th century was the fact that the Soviet Union was dismantled. And it's been
Mhm.
no secret that he's wanted to bring it back, or at least some form of the Soviet Union, in as much as possible. But to your other point, the recent situation I've been following very closely for the last 6 months. The war has been going on for about 5 months, but before that, there was a lot of buildup of Russian troops on the border, and there was a lot of anticipation that there would be a war. So I was following it very, very closely. And my research involves uh, many, many different sources. I basically researched British sources, French news, German news, and a lot of Russian news. So I purposely would
Mhm.
go on places like RT, Russia Today, and to see what they had to say. So I look at all sides of the issue. I had numerous online debates and discussions with people from the Russian position because I don't want to just first come out and attack their side without hearing what they have to say. So I'm very familiar with the Russian arguments. I've also spent many, many hours listening to numerous speeches from Putin,
Mhm.
numerous essays that he's written. So I wanted to get a very good understanding of what his position is and what he has had to say.
Mhm. Right. And talking about the importance of this book and the aim, what kind of end goals do you have for this book? What do you aspire to achieve through this book?
Well, my end goal is to create. greater awareness on the public of what is going on. Basically, I believe that if everybody in the world just read this book, or at least everybody in Russia, I believe that the war would end, because the support for the war would end. So these kind of wars are based on propaganda and lies. And when enough people believe the lies and believe the propaganda, that gives them fuel for the war. So that's what supports the war, is the lies. So by exposing the lies, exposing the propaganda and the fiction, that lessens the fuel and the energy for the war, and that would bring an end to this. So, for example, there are many examples I give in the book, but just to give one small example, one of the many lies that Putin says, and when I say Putin, I'm talking about Putin, his inner circle, his elites, his team, coming from Putin, from the Kremlin. One of the lies that he has is that he says that Ukraine has been taken over by Nazis, and that there are Nazis everywhere in Ukraine, and that he's sending in Russian troops to go in and liberate the Ukrainians and free them from these Nazis. Okay. Now, as I point out, that is a complete lie. It's total propaganda. It's a complete myth. It's complete fiction. That is not what's going on. But many people in Russia actually believe that, because when they watch TV, and all of the TV now is all state controlled. It's all Kremlin controlled. So they only hear what Putin wants them to hear, what the Kremlin wants them to hear. And they hear this day in and day out. They all believe now that there are Nazis everywhere in Ukraine, and that their troops are doing a good thing. They're going in and trying to liberate the Ukrainians from Nazis. Okay, but that's a complete lie. That's not what's going on at all. But they don't know any different, because that's what they hear every day. Now, just to be clear, one of the things I point out is, to most lies, there's always sometimes a tiny grain of truth to it. Okay, so for example, on the Putin people can point to that there maybe are a handful of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, but not enough to threaten Russia, not enough to be a problem. You're talking like maybe in the hundreds of people. And it turns out that there are many more Nazis and neo-Nazis in Russia than in Ukraine. There are weird groups all over the world, in every single country. Now, one of the things I point out in the book is that there is a group of more than 300, and it's actually growing every day, but over 300 world-class scholars. These are college professors that many of them are authors and lecturers, and people who spent their whole lifetime studying Nazism and World War II history and all of the related facts. They've all come together, and they wrote a very long letter, and they published it online. I quote the letter in the book. I give links to the letter. And they have all come out and said that there is no Nazi problem in Ukraine. That's all fiction. That's all mythology. I've been there multiple times. I've never seen any Nazis there. I've talked to numerous people. They've never seen any Nazis there. But yeah, Ukraine has approximately 44 million people. So in a country of 44 million people, yeah, can you find a handful of neo-Nazis? Yes, that's probably true. But are they a threat to Russia? No, they're not a threat to Russia. So that's one of the things I point out, is that's what's called a pretext. So pretext is just a made-up excuse. The real reason, as I point out, is Putin wants to bring Ukraine back into Russian control. He wants to steal the country. He wants to steal the assets, steal their oil and gas, steal their grains. He wants to control their strategic ports. He wants the assets. So all of this other stuff, it's all lies. It's just all made up fiction. And the sooner people realize that, the sooner that this war will come to an end.
Right. That is also from the other perspective, right? Like, we know that Ukraine is trying to get the support of the United States, and Russia is is not very comfortable with that, right? So there's also the other side of the story where we hear that is also part of what the American um, political parties, or probably America in general, is trying to do, which is to get control of Russia. So Ukraine has become the scapegoat, right? So how do we look at things, like, how do we discern what is true and what is not over here?
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually one of the key talking points. That's good you brought that up. Okay. So Ukraine has wanted to have a good friendly relationship with the United States, but um, they do not want to become the 51st state of the United States. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to become that close. They don't want to become part of the United States. Now, what Ukraine does want to do is they want to become part of the European Union.
EU, yeah.
Yeah, the EU. So they're
Mm-hmm.
more interested in forging a connection with the EU than the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They do want to keep things open and friendly with the United States, but they consider themselves a European country. They are the biggest country in Europe outside of Russia. So, other than
Mm-hmm.
Russia, Ukraine is the biggest European country. They consider themselves European, and they do want to trade with Europe. They do want to be close to Europe. And obviously, Putin and other Russians do not like that. But that
Mm-hmm.
is their free will choice. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's it's now I understand that's disheartening to Putin and to a lot of Russians, because they at one point back in the Soviet Union days they had control over Ukraine. The Soviet
Mm-hmm.
Union uh, broke up in 19. It basically was dismantled in 1991 by Gorbachev, and it went away. And it was sad for a lot of people, but it was also a happy moment for a lot of people. It was a failed state. It didn't work. It went apart. It fell apart. Um, that's the way things go. And so Putin and other people in his circle, they want to bring it back, but it's kind of like a company that had a bad product. They went out of business. People didn't like the product. Their product was communism. Communism didn't work. They went bankrupt. The whole social order fell apart. Um, Ukraine uh, is an independent sovereign country. They declared their independence on August 24th, 1991.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And shortly after that, Russia, who was headed by Boris Yeltsin at that point, um, signed on to it. He agreed with it. He had no problems. There was no contingencies. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. That's the end. That's the end of it. They became an independent country in 1991, and that's the end of the that was the end of the road. Shortly after that, that was the same year that the Soviet Union dissolved. Okay, now basically what's happening is Putin and his inner circle, they have sour grapes about that. They're not happy about that, but that's the reality. Now I'm going to go one step further. Okay, very very important fact, and that is this: after the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine still had on its territory approximately 1,700 nuclear weapons. 1,700. Actually, they had the third biggest amount of nuclear weapons in the world, next to
Mm-hmm.
the United States and Russia. Okay, so in 1994, there was a major international agreement that was signed by the UK, the US, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and a couple of other countries. Okay, in this international agreement, Ukraine, this is 1994, they agreed to give up all of their nuclear weapons. all 1,700 of them, every one of them, to turn them over to Russia. Okay. Now, what did they get for that agreement? Okay. What they got was this: they give them their weapons and all, and they get a promise from Russia that Russia would respect their sovereignty, which they have not done now. They've broken that agreement. The other part of that agreement was that Russia would respect their independence. They have not done that. They've broken that agreement. And the other part was that Russia agreed that they would never attack Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And now they've broken that agreement. Mm-hmm. So there were three things, three major components of that deal. And Russia has now broken all three major components of that agreement. They were supposed to respect their sovereignty, respect their independence, and they promised to never attack Ukraine. There was a little caveat in there: unless Ukraine attacks them first, then they could defend themselves. But that has not happened. Everybody knows Ukraine has not attacked Russia. Okay, so the fact that Russia is feeling bad or isolated because Ukraine wants to be closer to the EU, that's a sad fact, but that's reality. That's their choice. They are a free and sovereign country. If they want to get closer to the EU, that's their choice. That doesn't, so Russia coming in and attacking Ukraine, this is not even a close decision. This is completely wrong on every single level. Every single level. It's illegal. It's been, the other point, there's so many points that I go over in the book. This is not even a close decision. Now, a lot of people do have moral problems with this, and they don't know. There's so much Russian propaganda out there. They're not really sure. Is Putin right? Is Ukraine right? Is Putin the good guy? Is he the bad guy? So here's another crucial point that people forget about, and that is this: all of these issues were debated earlier this year in the United Nations. Okay. The United Nations had a major vote on March 2nd, and that was to reconfirm whether Ukraine is indeed a sovereign country, and whether Russia should be condemned and end their invasion. Okay, so these are some of the brightest minds in the whole world debated this issue for several days. The Russian ambassador got a chance to air all of his points and to make all of his, whatever he wanted to say, in front of the whole world at the United Nations. So everybody aired their points, okay? And this was voted on early March. And after everything was voted on, the vote was this: 141 countries voted to confirm that Ukraine is indeed a sovereign, independent country. Nobody was questioning that except for Russia and a few people in their sphere of influence. Okay, and they also voted to condemn the Russian invasion, and that Russia needs to immediately withdraw from Ukraine. Okay, now on the Russian side, there was Russia. Russia had voted, obviously, for their own position to not condemn themselves, and only 4 countries voted in favor of Russia. Okay, those 4 countries that voted to side with Russia were North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and Eritrea. Okay, all 4 of those countries are somewhat considered either puppet or client states of Russia, and they all have very bad human rights records and very bad freedom of press records. Okay, so basically you have 4 versus 141. That's not even close. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because these issues have already been debated and discussed. It's a closed case. The brightest minds in the United Nations have looked at all of this, and they've already condemned 141 to 4. And again, these 4 countries that support Russia, they're some of the worst countries in the world. So 141 to 4, they've all condemned Russia. So Russia has no good points in its favor. This invasion is so wrong on so many levels. It's not even close. Nobody. If people were to buy my book and read through it, they would gain moral clarity, and they would understand that Russia is completely in the wrong. And I understand that there are 50,000 trolls out there day and night that they're pushing messages that Putin is the good guy, Putin's right, he's fighting globalists and da da da, and the other countries are wrong. But it's not even close. Putin is completely in the wrong, and people need to realize that.
And talking about the situation in Ukraine and the kind of impacts people have been going through this so far, losing homes, losing families, and being stranded underground for so many days, so many weeks and months right now. Um, what do you think is the direction forward for the people in Ukraine, and what is the best they could do right now? Because I think a lot of people are actually it's just in the dilemma of waiting to see if things get better, or if they should just flee the country forever and just start somewhere new. So tell us a little bit about, from your observation, about what's going on the ground level with the people in Ukraine.
Oh, right. That's very important. That's very good that you brought that up. Okay. So, what's going on is just terrible. It's a humanitarian crisis. Now, let's say, getting back to the earlier point that I discussed, are there this fiction about are there Nazis in Ukraine? There might be. It's hard to say. Some neo-Nazis that maybe they are in the hundreds of people, but they're not threatening Russia, and they're not. And that's an internal problem. The president of Ukraine, uh, uh, President Zelensky, is Jewish. He has had relatives who died in the Holocaust. So if there were a Nazi problem, and there's not, because all these scholars and everybody's already testified that there is no Nazi problem in Ukraine. Okay, but a Jewish president would certainly take action to clean that up. Okay, but it's so minuscule that this is just a red herring and a pretext. Okay, but the reason I mention that is that, let's say, if there were a few hundred Nazis in Ukraine, does it make sense to destroy the lives of at least 15 million people? And actually a lot more than that. But let me put it this way. Here are the hard numbers. And these numbers change every day. Okay, but the conservative estimates are this: at least roughly 7 million people, Ukrainians, have had to flee the country. 7 million. So 7 million they're now like homeless refugees in other countries. They've lost everything. What? Because there were supposedly a few hundred Nazis somewhere. Okay, 7 million. But that's not even the total story. There's also now about, and these numbers change every day, another 8 million Ukrainians that had to flee their homes, but they're still in Ukraine, some other city in Ukraine. So if you add the 7 million to the 8 million, that's 15 million that had to leave their homes. Half of those are out of the country, roughly, and then another half are somewhere other place in the country. A lot of these people, they're hanging out in bomb shelters. They're starving. Well, they have little food. They're relying on charity. They have a shortage of medical supplies. Their lives have just been ruined. So you have at least 15 million people where their lives have been totally ruined and devastated. But that's not even the end of it, because Ukraine had a population of 44 million people. So that means that even from there's still another 29 million people that they're not in a good situation either. Maybe they haven't had to flee their homes, but they've seen their cities bombed, their infrastructure's been destroyed. It's hard for them to get food and medical supplies. The whole country of 44 million people, they've totally had their lives disrupted. So some had to leave the country, some had to leave their cities. So their lives have just been ruined. And what's ironic about that is one of the the Putin claims, this actual statement was made by Prime Minister Lavrov. He said some months ago. He said, we're going in to liberate Ukraine. Okay, liberation. 15 million people had to leave had to flee their homes, and they're living as refugees, and that's somehow liberation. Okay, and then the other statement he said was that we want to liberate Ukraine, and then let the Ukrainians decide what kind of government they want. Okay, now again, that's more ridiculous propaganda because, and I'm going to get back to your other point, but just I have to throw this out there. So he said that they want to liberate Ukraine, so the Ukrainians can decide what kind of government they want. Now that completely ignores the reality that in 2019, just 3 years ago, the Ukrainians had an election and they did already decide what kind of government that they want. They voted for President Zelensky. In fact, he won overwhelmingly by a landslide of 72.3% of the vote, which almost nobody wins with that kind of landslide. So he won with 72.3% of the vote, and they made their decision. The Ukrainians, they voted for Zelensky. They did not vote for Putin. They did not vote for Lavrov. They didn't vote for anybody else. Okay, but getting back to your other good question, what's going on with that? It's terrible. I have talked to so many people from Ukraine, and their lives have just been ruined. Millions have had to flee the country. Millions have had to move out of their homes. They've seen their buildings destroyed. Their infrastructure is destroyed. Hospitals have been destroyed. A couple of thousand schools have been destroyed. Stores have been destroyed. Train stations have been destroyed. Life is just miserable in Ukraine. They had such a nice, peaceful life before this. They weren't, they're very friendly people. Again, I've been there multiple times. They were not threatening anybody. They were not threatening Russia. They were just living their lives, enjoying their lives. And now all of a sudden, their whole world has come crashing down. So it is not a good situation for Ukrainians right now. Many of them are starving. They're in fear for their lives. In some cities, there are bombs that are going off day in and day out. Bombs, sometimes they can hear bombing starting at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and it just goes constantly. So this is a terrible, terrible situation, and this did not have to happen at all. This was solely because of Putin and his inner circle. So this is all wrong on every level. Now, does Putin have any gripes about things? Yeah, he may have some gripes. Maybe he's disappointed that the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. That's the way reality goes. Everybody has gripes. I have gripes. My friends have gripes. Everybody has gripes. But you can't come in and just start murdering people and destroying the country because you have some gripes. The estimates are that, and it's hard to get accurate numbers. There are different estimates, but conservative estimates are that at least 50,000 Ukrainians, civilians, have been killed. That's civilians. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died defending their homeland. And then tens of thousands, maybe another 30, 40,000 soldiers have been wounded. And again, we're talking millions have had to flee the country. Millions have had to move. So this is just a terrible, terrible situation. Now, just to keep in mind, as I mentioned in the book, I am not what they call a Russophobic person. So I don't dislike Russians or anybody. I love people all over the world. Okay, I dislike people. I do dislike people who go into other countries and want to murder people for no good reason. Okay, so I have had over the years many really great, nice Russian friends, and I respect many Russian heroes. There are many Russian heroes who are fighting the Putin regime. People like Alexei Navalny, who's now in prison for exposing Russian corruption. People like ex-world chess champion Garry Kasparov. He was a Russian. He had to flee the country back in 2013 because of possible political persecution. There were just many, many other heroes. There were thousands of Russians who were protesting the war. They're all heroes. Although now protesting it becomes much more dangerous because Russia has created new laws that state that if anybody, essentially, now I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, if anybody says anything that is contrary or counter to the Kremlin narrative and the Kremlin fiction, they could possibly be prosecuted and face up to 15 years in prison. So it's very, very difficult for people in Russia, to criticize the war now. They're not allowed to use the word invasion or war, which is exactly what this is. So if you use those words, you can be criminally prosecuted. So again, I don't hate Russians or anybody just because they're Russian. I accept all nationalities, but I am against people who want to go in and kill Ukrainians just because they want to take over their territory. But it's a very, very rough situation. Now, I have known people, I can't get into many details, but I'll just say I have known people who personally who were in bomb shelters recently in Ukraine in fear for their life, with little food, little medicine, and it's been a terrible, terrible situation. And it's still going on. And I've talked to them as they were in the bomb shelters, and in the weeks surrounding that. I can't go into any more details than that because still have family there that are under threat.
Right. So I think we have extensively discussed about Putin and the kind of invasion Ukraine is seeing right now, the aftermath and the impacts, as well as how people, before this can be confused between the media, what the media is saying, what is right and what is wrong. And I think through your book, people will be able to understand a little bit about the background of the Ukraine-Russia war and how it all started and what is the propaganda behind it. We will be able to see from your perspective, from your experience, and I think you have written quite in detail, also sharing a little bit about your ancestors, your grandmother, your roots from Ukraine, and from their perspective. I think that's a good representation from you, coming from you, having roots in Ukraine, and still being in touch with people in the Ukraine. So you will be able to give us your unbiased perspective. And I think this would also be beneficial to a lot of people out there wanting to read more on the Ukraine Russia war right now. So thank you so much for joining us today and explaining a little bit about your book and why is it so important for people out there to read in order to grasp a basic understanding of what's going on. And I think it will be definitely very helpful because I believe you have condensed a lot of content, a lot of facts and figures in your book, and that would make things easy for people to go through and understand further. So thank you so much for what you're doing right now, and we do really hope that the war would come to an end and people in the Ukraine can actually have a semblance of life before the war, at least, and come back to Ukraine. Those who have gone out of the country come back to Ukraine and have a peaceful life ever. I mean, it is difficult to believe that, we, as we are talking right now, I think there are people in Ukraine who are fighting for their lives, and there are people dying, and just the sheer thought of it is really sad, I mean, it could have been us in that place. So with that, I think, thank you so much for doing this, for writing the book, and people can actually get this book on Kindle paperback. It's on Amazon, so they can actually go and check this book out. I've actually shared the Amazon page over here, which is right on screen, as you can see. So this is where people can check the book out and leave a review for the book as well after they are done. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today, and hopefully we will meet again in another interview series. So I'm going to be putting this video up on Instagram and also on YouTube, so that you'll get more exposure, and I'll be sending the links to Instagram and also YouTube as well once it's up. Thank you so much for joining, and see you soon again.
Well, thank you very much, and I totally agree with what you said, and it was very well stated. Very, very well put what you had to say, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank
Okay.
you so much. We will see you soon.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.